You're listening to the official broadcast of the Westside Vineyard in Los Angeles, a community of individuals and families connecting with God to change the world.
There is the kind of developing of populist guerrilla forces working out of the jungles and kind of in constant battle against the government forces in terms of seeking rightness. And the tragedy in that is that so often it is at a very young age that young boys, sometimes young girls, are recruited and they're drawn into these troops. And it's kind of like, here's purpose. Here's your purpose. Join us in this resistance. And now here's power. We're going to give you a gun. And so as the years go on, this is their identity. They've been given. And they live in the jungles and they fight as soldiers and they carry that. And some of you may know that in Colombia, there has been that group that is understood the soldiers as being part of the FARC. And they have been at war for 52 years. It is the longest standing war in the Western Hemisphere, is there in Colombia. Tens of thousands recruited into these troops, fighting out of the jungles as guerrillas. Well, in just the last few years, there was finally peace talks as a new government is kind of settling and bringing some peace. And the question they have faced is there any way, how are we going to be able to take these who have been their whole lives rooted in this identity and begin to convince them that without firing a gun, without taking force, we can demobilize and we could have them re-enter society. And that's been the tragedy of the division of these lives drawn away and recruited. And so they actually hired a marketing guy. And he's come and he began in 2011 and 12, and he began with these campaigns, and the biggest ones were Christmas campaigns, where he created these large lights on balloons that would lower down and enlighten the roads out of the jungle back to the towns where some could find their way home. And it was like an invitation at Christmas to come home. And they were significant and they did well. But as they reached the next point, they knew they had to think more deeply. So in 2012, coming to Christmas 13, they came up with a new campaign, and it was simply called Mothers' Voices. And they went to mothers, and they said, some of you, are you willing to just acknowledge and help us that you've got kids, they were recruited, and there were 37 mothers in particular that identified and they had pictures of their children. They had to use pictures where they were so young that they wouldn't be recognizable to any other, of their adult comrades, that only they would see themselves in those pictures. And they took and they made these posters, and they put them on the intersections and on trees. And the message that was with them said this: before you were a guerrilla, you were my child. Come back home. I'm waiting for you. It was the essence of the message. And out they came. Initially, over 200 came out and took the invitation to come home. And that's a reminder of something about the power of mothers' voices. And it's a way to I think, recognize that you who are mothers, this is true certainly of fathers as well, and all of us in the spiritual way, but particularly of mothers, you have a profound voice. Because you know something of what it's like in your soul to recognize that ones that you have brought in this world, and you know who they are, have been recruited. They've been recruited to identify themselves with other powers in this world. And to be told, this is your purpose, and here, that rifle that you're holding on to, this is your power in this world. And you've known them to be recruited to different means, different forms, but the same type of recruitment, and there's a part of your heart that says, this is not who you are. And I think there's a lot of moms who would like to be able to say that and carry that deeply in your heart, and you have that power. But I also think that this is how God sees you and I. God sees us as those who in many ways, many respects, have been recruited by that which offers us some sense of this is who you really are. Let me give you your identity. Let me give you your power, and then I own you. You're ours. And it's to this that we see that God has come in and said, I'm not done. Human life and human creation is still mine, and I'm going to break in, and I'm going to come and seek and go after those. And when he does, and this is what we see in Jesus coming as the Messiah, the incarnate into the world, that not surprisingly, he confronts the very force of identity. And we read this initially in one of the gospel accounts in the scriptures. In Matthew, we can read it. We see it in other accounts. And we read in Matthew 3, where we're told how Jesus comes and he tells John the Baptist, who's kind of a forerunner, that he wants to be baptized by him. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense to John. Why would I baptize you? I've just declared, I know who you are. You're the Messiah. You're the one coming from God. But he says, it's to set me apart. And so this is his moment. And when he's baptized, it says, he comes up out of the water, and we read, behold, a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. This is my Son. And then it says, then Jesus was led by the Spirit. As soon as this has taken place, as soon as he has this identity grasped, he was led into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Now, what goes on to be explained there is that he goes off and he fasts for 40 days in this time in the desert. Well, when you enter a time of fasting, and I know that's not so familiar to many of us, but at the essence of it, it's not a weight loss program. At the essence of it, the idea of fasting is you're willing to keep yourself from being attached to the things that you normally find kind of provide for yourself, kind of your identity, your satisfaction, so that you press yourself into the deeper places in which you realize the essence of who you are, what provides, what matters. So it's not a matter of just trying to be grumpy and hungry and all that. It's really a matter of pressing to the deep place of, I'm not defined by merely what I consume. And so it can be a place of great spiritual discovery, if you will, and deepening. And so he's in that process. And there, it says the enemy comes to him, the spiritual force of evil comes to him. And not surprisingly, because it's usually when we step back and face ourselves that the enemy wants to come and confront us. So we use the term, you have to face your demons. Well, this is literally kind of that. So the enemy comes to him, and we read how he begins to tempt him. And he tempts him with these 3 temptations, and they're all really about identity. The first is, you know what? Turn these stones into bread. Use your power. Your power. Isn't that cool? He's been saying that to us ever since. Use your power to satisfy and provide for yourself. Oh, I'm all in. Then the second, hey, jump off this place and call upon the angels. Use your power to kind of thrill and be popular and gain that. And finally he comes to the third, where we read, it says again in verse 8, the devil took him to a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these, everything, because he has everything, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, be gone, Satan, for it is written. So he defies him here. You shall worship the Lord your God and him only shall you serve. And it says the devil left him. In that moment, something really profound has happened. And I think it's the defining moment for him and ultimately for us. In that moment, the enemy comes after to say, look, I own everyone's identity. See, what we don't understand is that we've all given our allegiance, so I own everyone. So you think you have a different identity? I'm going to come and show that you're really just one of me. You'll bow down, you'll join me, you'll give me your allegiance. Except Jesus doesn't. And in that moment, Jesus becomes resolute. He becomes deeply dangerous to the enemy. Now, the enemy would carry on very dramatically. You read through the rest of the Gospels, and they're in this conflict. And he thinks maybe at the crucifixion that he has kind of somehow won, but he hasn't. But you see this kind of intensity, because when you stand against the powers that rule this earth, you intensify those things. So he has this, Jesus defies him, and the enemy is kind of thrown, but just ratchets it up. And for Jesus, there's this resoluteness by which it appears nothing can stop him. There's this force because there's this deep resolve. And this is what Jesus is after in us. And the first thing that we need to grasp is just recognizing, number one, that the world has been ruled by a spiritual force who gains control as we give our trust to this self-glorifying power that comes in wealth and fame and pleasure. When Jesus engages him at this moment, it reveals to us what lies behind all of life in so many ways. We're told how, in this kind of poetic fashion of describing our roots, that in the garden, that is God's original design for human life, that in the garden we were created to bear God's image, to be partnered in this temporal created realm, that we're going to be with God, ruling and taking care of things. And then a serpent, we're told, comes in and suggests, really? You could be your own gods. That's the suggestion. And we gave ourselves to that, and we have been ruled ever since, under the power and control of the idea that we can be the glorified ones. And really, we're willing to sell out to another who, in a sense, draws us into that. So there's this self-glorifying pursuit of life, and the enemy uses it to say wealth will give it to you, and pleasure will give it to you, and various forms of force will give it to you, and popularity, it doesn't get any better, that one will give it to you, and then you can be glorified. And it's like we have a contract, and those are the terms of the contract, and none of us realize it. But the enemy's like, you signed you joined in. You're all part of it. It's like a collective contract. And that's this force that we see that Jesus is bringing to bear. And so I know that can be, hard to imagine. But this is really the reality the scriptures tell us. Any of you who are familiar or perhaps fans of J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, it's really what Tolkien is trying to grasp in The Lord of the Rings. The ring represents that there is something that will consume us, and it is the pursuit of power. The ring gives the bearer of the ring the belief that somehow they have all power, but they've realized that it is at the expense. It will ultimately consume one and destroy them, and they must destroy the ring. So together, they come and they realize if we do not confront and destroy the powers that have been given, that everybody is going to pursue, and they struggle with it throughout the whole of the story, because we all can be subdued by the desire for power, by the illusion of our self-glorifying lives. But in the end, it's nothing. It consumes us. And so that is the battle. Now, I know that's a big statement to make, to think that somehow this defines all of life. Some of us, it's not that hard to grasp because it's our stories. Some of us go, yeah, my whole life I've really been lost in this kind of pursuit of self-glory that I get a sense I need to constantly battle. And when I lose to it, it kind of consumes me and I become lost. And I need to get myself. Some of us really identify with that. For some, we may wonder, really, is there really such a spiritual force at hand? Does this really describe human life? And I would encourage you, take an honest look at human history and human life. I don't think it's hard stretch to say this is what we find about human life. We're not discovering ourselves. We're lost trying to be discovered and selling ourselves. Some of you might be in middle school. Everybody was in middle school once. It's that part of life that you're trying to forget really hard, And when you're in that age and stage, you are like, I just want to fit in. I need to know that I belong, and I will do what? Anything to belong. I just so deeply need it. And then we all scoff at, oh yeah, I remember that, and think we grew up. Really? What's true in middle school is true in middle management. We're doing the same thing from middle school to middle management to the Middle East. It is all about trying to find that we can find our self-glorifying, role. That somewhere where people will recognize our greatness and find it in us, not in whom we come from. Like we become some end and we fit. It describes why we have terrorism in kind of in this way that we've never maybe seen before. I think in forms it's always there. But we think sometimes in the Western culture, like, what is this that people would die for? They're suicide bombers. They strap bombs on themselves. Why? One word: identity. Because when you have no power and purpose, and someone says, I know, you got nothing. Your life is meaningless. I'll give you purpose. You will make a difference. And you will be like a hero among us. Okay? And I'll give you a power, a gun or a bomb. I will give that to you. And you will know who you are. That's the power. And we think that's crazy. And you know what? They look at the West and say, really, you think terrorism's crazy? Have you looked at television? It's selling everybody who they are. And they're just watching and so, this is who you want me to be? You need to be like this, look like this, buy this, have this. And we're just like, So from terrorism to television, it's kind of the human dynamic. And if you kind of are on that television, you kind of turn around and look a little bit. And you have it running where people take on religion. So you have religious leaders and they're selling prosperity. If you do this, you will find that you can have prosperity and power, etc. And people are like willing to kind of give themselves to something that's quite manipulated to gain this sense of, therefore I will be blessed and anointed. It's kind of manipulative. Then you change the channel to the real estate programs. And you go, really? If you buy my program, you will be a billionaire and have the mansion and the women and the cars that you see around me. What's it selling? Identity. You can sell yourself to the self-glorifying power and finally matter. This is what it is that is being confronted. And I believe that we have to understand this is our life situation. This is what Jesus understood lies behind all of our lives. This is why Jesus engages that, confronts that, and his desire is to awaken us to draw out of this. This is what Jesus understood as the world that we live in. And so we need to understand that when he speaks of the world, and the scriptures do, and the others writers do, of the world in a negative light, this is what they're referring to. They're not referring to the world in terms of the planet or any element of the planet. That's created by God. It's good. And there's so many things about life that are good in and of themselves. What's he talking about? The fact that we sell ourselves to them. And the fact that there are forces that are telling us and controlling us to be self-glorifying beings who will sell ourselves to anything in order to hopefully become something that we never can become in and of ourselves. And that is the force, and that is what Jesus is really confronting in all of these ways. And this is why what Jesus sees is something very different. When he speaks of do not belong to the world, he's not saying don't live here and don't even love here. He's not speaking of here. He's speaking of the forces that are behind and at work, that are running not just in the world, but through the world. It's not just behind the scenes with an enemy, it's us. We've given ourselves to it, and we have to face that we're the ones who have to come out of that place. Like the soldier who's holding a gun, they weren't forced to become soldiers. They're not merely trying to escape another who they feel imprisoned by. They would say, I am a soldier. I am one of these. And so would we in ways, if we're honest, that this is who I am. And unless we come out from that, we will be, in a sense, facing the same demise that the whole world will ultimately face. This is what Jesus says. So he comes in his mission, he begins to recruit these lives to follow him in resistance and defiance of the world. He's basically saying, want to join the resistance? I will root you back in your true home where you belong. And then we can stand up and face this. Listen to the words he prays to the Father as he's coming to the end. And we read these in John 17 where he says, Father, and he's praying to him now on behalf of those who follow. I don't ask that you take my followers out of the world, but keep them safe from the evil one, the one who is after them. He understands that. We're not comfortable with that. We're like, hey, I'm my own person. He's like, yeah, really? You're not as much an independent person as you think. There are forces that want you, and you will think you're independent even when you've given yourself to another. Keep them safe from that one. They don't belong to this world, and neither do I. This is not their ultimate home. That eternal Father is the one with whom we belong. Your word is the truth. So let this truth make them completely yours. Now, when we hear that, we think, oh, they just learn the Bible, learn a lot more Bible verses. He must be talking about that, just know that the Word, and somehow you and I will be protected. It's not that quite that simple. He's saying that the very Word that is eternal, which spoke creation into being, by the way, because God declared creation, it comes into being, that very power of that Word is eternal. And when that truth, which is that which is captured and living in the Scriptures, when that truth that is eternal is what sets you apart, in a sense, which is what it means to kind of be refined by and known by, when that word gets you, oh, then you have won the enemy. When that authority is defining your life, that is when you will stand strong. And that will be what makes you completely His. And you live out of that place. So you can read Bible, but it's ultimately about being rooted in Him. I am sending them into the world, not out of it, into the world, just as you sent me. And so it is that we kind of have this idea of our relationship to this world in kind of general Christian thinking, that is that we are in the world, but not of the world. And that is what we truly should be living in. Sometimes when we think this way about, oh, I'm not in the world, but I'm of the world, but I'm in the world, we almost though feel like we're kind of resigned to being in it. You got to live here for a while. It's really a bummer. But just don't get too involved and caught up in it. That's not the spirit of what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, I came here. I actually came after this world. That's my intent. That's part of my identity. I am the God who is after this world. So it is not an invitation to care less about this world. It's an invitation to care more about this world. And to care so much about it that you and I are realizing that if we're going to have a redemptive presence, one that makes a positive difference, then we need to not be simply of it, because something's not right here. And we have to come into that place of getting ourselves right, and then we live in defiant resistance and make a difference. And this is what He's rooting them in, and this is what it means to be able to declare for any of us, I don't belong to this world. That is not a resignation saying this world's bad or the people in it are bad and I'm better. No, it's none of that. It's saying, but this is not where I fundamentally belong. Like the soldier who says, look, I'm not against my fellow soldiers. And we may have even had good reasons to be in camaraderie together. But you know what? My mom's right. There's another home to go to. This isn't where I began, and it's not where I'm meant to end. And so it is that Jesus is coming to bring this to bear. And we sometimes are afraid, yeah, but if I don't take this world seriously and I'm not like fully in and just giving my whole self to succeeding, I won't do well. I can never do well if I'm not like just drawn. I got to do everything. I'm driven. I got to succeed. You know, the truth is just the opposite. Those who are most free from finding and proving themselves in something do the best in it, in anything. When you are so trying to prove that you fit, that you can succeed, that you are good enough, you don't do your best. When you're free from it, you actually can come and be more redemptive to even the things that this world appropriately involves. And Jesus understands that, and He's inviting us to know, point number 2, that the power to unite with Jesus in being distinct from this world lies not in our separation or superiority, but in our freedom from belonging to its power to control who we are. So many times we think, oh, Jesus, if I follow Him, I'm supposed to be part of His religious group. No, He's not inviting us to join some religious elite who think of themselves as, I'm separate and I'm superior. That was the religious group that He confronted, because that's the way they thought. And what were they doing? They just created a subgroup. Here's our subgroup, our religious national identity. And in our national identity, we're better than everybody else. This is our identity. We're separate and superior to everything else in this world. Jesus confronts that. He's not inviting us to join the religious elite. He's inviting us to join the resistance. A resistance that runs right through this world that's a lot more powerful than some separation or superiority. He's inviting us to stand up and say, I'm not going to belong here, and I'm not going to look for these false senses of power. And this is what we see. And we see that it's not easy to do that, because the truth is we all want approval. We all have a natural inclination to want approval from other people. And that's not wrong. It's natural. The problem isn't wanting approval. The problem is when we need it. Need it at the very core of our being to be valid. When we have that deep of a need, we'll do anything to do it, to find that approval from others, and we will be kind of lost in the process of doing that. And this is why we see that when Jesus was tested, the enemy is really saying, can I tap into you like everybody else and prove that you need my approval and this world's approval? Because he offered him all these means to the approval of this world. And this is where the enemy went, uh-oh. He didn't. What made Jesus so powerful? If you could bring it down to this, he didn't need this world's approval. That is what made him powerful. That is what happened. And that is why he's inviting us to be people of freedom. And number 3, then we can affirm that the power of our true God-given identity and its freedom requires the courage then to say no. No to the identity that this world wants to offer. I think that what we tend to focus on is that the invitation to know God and to follow the life and enter the life of Jesus that he gave us is an invitation to say yes to God, and that's huge. But the problem we often miss is that it's never just about saying yes, because there is no yes without a no. Henry Cloud said it this way. He said, we must be able to say what is not me in order to have a me. Our yes has no meaning if we have no no. And so often we're saying, look, I'm fine with, I can kind of want to fit in with the God thing too, and I'll kind of fit in the God thing, but what we really are having a hard time with is not wanting to fit into everything. We kind of want everyone's approval. And when you want everyone's approval, you can have no one's approval. When you want to be everything, you are no one. And at some level, you and I will realize and have to realize more and more that if we really want to know somebody, don't think merely about what they say yes to, consider what they're willing to say no to. If you really want to understand yourself and who you really are, it may have less to do with what you say yes to and have a lot more to do with what you and I are willing to say no to. And a lot of us go, yeah, that's the hard part. It is. It's very, very hard in ways. Looking back over my life, I can go back and see how this was the hard challenge, and it remains a hard challenge, but it was very defining for me. Because as a young, kind of teen years, and really hearing about who Jesus was and how God had made himself known and come and sacrificed himself to set this world right, something seemed very right about everything I felt about this world. It's like, this sounds like what I think should be right about this world. And I think this could be true, but it also just spoke something deeply. It connected. It was sewed into my soul. This is true. I think God does love in this way. It's such a radical love. It's the kind of love I need. In fact, I don't know what else I could be saved by, but a love like this, who came and died for me and took away and took away my separation. This is incredible. And it took that place. And here's the challenge I faced. So I'm carrying this very real inside of me, but as I go to school and into my world, nobody else seemed to really understand that or get it or think of that. So I realized quickly in an unconscious way, we don't think much about it, I don't think they'd understand this. So I'm living in two worlds. I have this world over here that some people kind of get, but most of my world doesn't. So I begin to live out of these two identities. And some of you know what that's like. We all do. It's like, I don't know how to bring these together. I don't know how to live out of one. And so at times I would just kind of live out this other identity, and that would I'd have to kind of repress this one. And if you ever tried to repress the God voice in you, the work of God in you, you have to work really, really, really hard. And you start finding you need more distance and more distance and more distance. And I would do that and seek out more and more distance from God through these certain times and turns in my life. And it's ultimately kind of culminated with this moment which I realized as I'm getting older, I can't do that. I feel like I can't escape the world I'm in, but I can't escape the heart and voice of God. I can't. It's going to prove inescapable. So I needed to settle it. And that's a story in itself, but let's just say it got settled. At some level it got settled, and it was a matter of realizing that, you know what, I'm going to have to say no to this. And something very interesting I discovered is that as I kind of came out of that phase, now kind of into just young adulthood, it was some of my friends who kind of watched me through those years who were not people who shared my commitment to Christ, that they would kind of infer or comment in such a way as it became clear they actually respected me more when they knew me as the person willing to be different than when it seemed very clear that I was kind of ready to just run with whatever they were doing. And I started to look at that and realize everyone's looking for someone who's willing to be different. Everyone's looking to see if there's a force that's not just trying to fit in. But it took that coming to that place. And I think it sometimes is part of our journey that we have to kind of grow into. And I think of one life that captures this so well is the life of Moses. Moses doesn't need a lot of introduction. Many people kind of recall his beginnings. Numbers of movies and storytelling has been done of that, where at one point the Israelite people have made their way into Egypt during a time of famine, and the Egyptians begin to enslave them. They become slaves and labor, but they're growing so big in number that this becomes a threat. And so the Pharaoh of Egypt says, we must destroy all the newborns. And so the mother of Moses, an Israelite, says, I'm not going to do this. I believe God has more. She makes the basket and sends him down the Nile, where they were living upstream from where Pharaoh's daughter would come and the others to bathe. And so Pharaoh's daughter finds him, picks him up, takes him into the home, and you know the story. He's now raised in Pharaoh's household. And so now he spends his whole life knowing himself to be the son of Pharaoh, the great power of all the Egypt and the most powerful in the whole world at that time. But he's not. He's not ultimately an Egyptian. And so his whole life is one, if you will, of this identity crisis. And this is a real identity crisis. This is a tough deal, that he's facing. And this is legitimately an identity crisis. He's got it all. He's got what? He's got everything this world is saying you can find yourself glorifying in. Pharaoh is the ultimate in a self-glorifying. He declares himself to be God. This is just openly that. And wealth, all the wealth of the world, more of it existed under Pharaoh than anyone else on the planet as far as we know, because there was no empire at the time I'm aware of that was as great as Egypt. So Pharaoh has it all and openly has it all. This wasn't a democracy. He has it all. And the son would inherit and have it all. So he literally has, all the wealth you could imagine. And when it comes to popularity, the TMZ of the time was following him to any bar that he was going to. We want to know what you're up to. You're like the bachelor, the ultimate bachelor. You are insane. You can have anything you want. Everyone would want to be Moses. And as far as pleasure, it was just free. They could exploit anybody and have anything they want. He could have all the harems, he could have all the chariots, he could have all the pleasure he wants, freely. And that is what he'd have to decide. That's a tough one. He'd have to come to the place where I said, I can fake it and continue to have all this, but pretend, just go along, I'm an Egyptian. Or he'd have to decide, I'm not, though, I'm an Israelite, and come out with it and lose everything. And this is what's so profound. And I think we all have to come to that place where we read in Hebrews 11:24, it says, by faith, yeah, you bet, because he's not sure. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. What a powerful place to come to. He's saying, everything this world has to offer me, all of everything that would make me feel powerful, everything that would bring all that kind of affirmation and validity, I'm going to refuse to be known by that which I won't sell myself out to. I am not an Egyptian, he says. And out of that comes this radical transformation of life. And it's very telling, I think, though, what we see come out of that. Do you remember the Pharaoh's name? Anyone? Nope. We're not really sure. We take our best shots. But everyone remembers Moses. Why? Because he proved to be more powerful than the Pharaoh. Why? Because he's the one who said, I am not submitting myself to the powers of this. And that made him a liberator. That made him one who could bring profound freedom to human need. And so Moses becomes this great liberator. And I want to suggest that before we think how easy and great and short the story is, it wasn't. Did you notice the words it says, by faith, means he's not sure how it's going to work out, but he had to step out and say, I'm not. And it said, when he grew up, I don't think this is easy to grasp when we're young, but at some point as we grow, we're having to realize at some point, part of spiritual maturity, part of the maturity I need for this world is to know that I don't belong to it. And only then will you become one who can really form the strength as a person. Only then can you have a strong yes because you have a strong no. And so it says, as he grew up, he was able to say, I'm not going to be known as the Pharaoh's daughter. Now, here's one more thing just to quickly note, though, as he went through that. There's a part of him who thought, I'll be a hero to the Israelites. They're going to dig me. Just wait, because I'm like a big deal, And so when I come out and the Israelites see that I'm willing to be one of them, they're going to love me. So he goes out one day, and he sees an Egyptian striking one of the Israelite slaves, and he goes up and he strikes down the Egyptian. And you can imagine him turning around going, this is my moment, man. This is when they're all going to go, you're one of us. And they say, be gone. Get away from us, were their very words. What? They realize, you're going to create problems. We don't need the problems you're going to create by doing what you just did, so just get away from us. So he goes off into the desert for 40 years. That's quite a picture. And what's his home then? I'd say nowhere. He's living in the desert. Yes, he has a new family and he has a new role with sheep, but here's the point. He lives this totally unsettled life because he's now nowhere. He's now not really settled with any sense of who I am. All he wants to do, though, is says, I don't want anyone. I don't want to be an Egyptian. I'm willing to give that up, whatever. But I don't want the Israelites. They rejected me. I don't know if that's a cool deal, too. So I kind of want God out of the picture. So he goes off in the desert. And a lot of us, we're living in that place. We're living in this place where we're kind of like, well, I'm okay to be different, but I don't really feel settled anywhere. And what we see is that God comes in and interrupts his life and says, hey, Moses, after 40 years, burning bush, he engages him. And he says, no, I'm calling you out to be the liberator you were meant to be. And you might remember something of that conversation if you're familiar. Moses basically says, nah, I'm sorry, you got the wrong guy. I'm not up for it. Those people rejected me. I'm not the guy who can do that. I don't have what it takes. They're going to reject me. kind of like the way we might say, you know what, I don't want to really be identify as a Christian because they're all hypocrites. They're not, I don't really want to identify with them. And you know God's answer to that? I'm not really talking to you about them. I'm talking to you about you. Ultimately, this is my call on your life, and you can't define yourself by now talking about other people. You're back in the same problem. I'm asking you, will you let my voice tell you who you are and follow it? Stop directing and focusing out there just on a new group. See, Moses probably thought, well, we'll just change groups. I'll be popular with somebody. No, it's not about looking out there. It's about willingness to come and say, look, this is about who I choose to be. And so the last point I want to make is that, in this sense, is that maturity will require willingness to be faithful apart from what anyone else may see or affirm. You have to get to a place in which it's an audience of one. We don't find our identity merely among other people and how well we fit or how cool they are or their vibe. We're all recovering hypocrites, and we all kind of just are saying, but I'm trying to be faithful to him, and he's my audience, and he defines me. And I think this is a difficult place that many of our journeys come through and we have to come to. I know that I want to read, close reading some words of a mother who was writing in response to her 18-year-old son. And her 18-year-old son is kind of in that place where he's kind of taken off to kind of run away. And, I don't want to follow this way, but I don't know if I want to, what I'm going to do with Christ and God, because sometimes the people are just, and so not really sure and just kind of blaming everybody else. And she writes them these words after a conversation, and she says, I've thought constantly about our phone conversation since last night. I only wish I had all the right answers for you. I know you're going through a difficult time and have been most of this year trying to decide if you're going to live for the Lord or the world. It appears that you've compromised everything trying to straddle the fence, feeling one way but living the other. And that can really tear you apart. The thing is, what we have to do is make our own commitments and do our best right in the middle of the world. We can't live as monks, and we can't blame anyone else if we fall along the way. The responsibility is entirely our own. I was sure our social life would fall apart when I stopped drinking, but interestingly, it hasn't. People are just a bit more aware of their behavior. The point is simply, I had to decide what I was going to do, regardless of what others thought. So what I guess I'm saying is, you're going to have to decide who and what you're going to be from the inside, no matter where you are or who you're with. I wish I could be the perfect example for you, so I could say, see how right I am. But of course I'm not and never will be, and neither will anyone else. We're all going to make lots of mistakes. So put your trust in the only place that is constant, in the Lord, and accept the rest of us the way we are. We love you very much, Mom. I can tell you those words are very significant because they were written to me by my mom 39 years ago. I had taken off to, I'm just going to go surf. I'm just kind of running off. Spouted out all my stuff. Well, what about them? And she spoke this truth. And I'll tell you the honest thing is, it didn't mean much to me. I wasn't really prepared and cared for it. I didn't want to take it in. What I can also tell you is it defined the next 5 years of my life. What I came up against at this moment was she was utterly grasping the truth. It was time to stop blaming others, and I had to come to that place. And as I began to make choices, they were my choices, my parents weren't even involved with, nor were even my Christian friends. I had to go to this deep place in my own very personal space and say, this is who I'm going to be. And it wasn't easy at all, not at all. But out of it came the best time I've ever had in terms of discovering how much I really can be different It's when I began to walk around college campus and realize it's Jesus and me. I'm not sure anyone understands me, and that's not the worst thing. But no one understands me. They don't get me. It's the first time I started to realize, well, Jesus does, and I'm not really as enamored with knowing that everybody else understands me, because it looks like kind of a crazy world. And that began to give me a place where my life was more redemptively lived in the world. And it could be real, because it wasn't about superiority. It was just about a deep personal place. That's the invitation. That's God's call to each of us in some level. I'm still working that out. But I know that like those mothers in Colombia, those mothers who realize you're not what you've been recruited to be in this world. You're holding your gun so tightly because it is like your identity. Some of us are holding things so tightly. I can't let go of that. That's my... There is a voice that knows better. There is a voice who says, that's not totally who you are. Even that gun might have a place, but it's not your identity. And there's that voice that is from heaven that says, no, I am the eternal voice. And when you realize you belong to that which transcends what fads are on, you sell yourself to a fad, it's the most short-lived thing you'll ever know. The opposite of a fad, an eternal voice. Timeless. And you belong to the eternal voice. And when you start to connect and root yourself deeply and personally to that voice, you start to live out of that place. And that's what it means to say, I don't belong to this world. Let's pray.
Thank you for listening to the official broadcast of the Westside Vineyard in Los Angeles. Tune in for next week's message.